Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Voss, Dragon of the Southern Tier. I'm happy to be here with you today on March 15th of 2022 to talk about an issue that is very important for all of us. A question that will be coming up in November and is growing in importance by the day. That, of course, is the question of election integrity versus voter apathy. It's an issue that we've been hearing about a lot in the last month or two, and we're going to hear more. But it's a question that doesn't have a really clear answer, or at least not in the way that the elected politicians are presenting it to the American people. And we want to address that a little bit because of a webinar that we saw yesterday from Look Ahead America that we want to address. Now, before we get started, we do want to mention that if this is the first time that you're seeing our channel, we want to welcome you and we thank you. We want you to know that we do long-form political commentary. And of course, every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you. We reach out on all the social media that the internet overlords will allow to hear your voice, to hear what you think from anywhere in the world about the issues that are affecting us all. And that means that we go on, we take your chats, your tweets, your phone calls from anywhere in the world to tell us what you think. Even when your government may disagree, even when the internet overlords disagree, we want to hear your voice. So we hope you'll join us this Sunday and every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the question today is about voter apathy. It's not a new question. It's a question that's been around for decades. And it has a lot of components. And it's also a question of election integrity, how these two things come together and how they affect us in every election. And they've been affecting us in elections for a long time. And we'll give you an example of that. This is a part of a conversation that we had back in 2014 with WUTQ, which is out of Utica and is a news talk program. And we were on the Talk of the Town program at that time. And we had this to say about elections, voter apathy.
There's been a couple of reports out last week, and it's really amazing. Pollsters across the nation are trying to sell the idea that the public just aren't going to show up. Their belief is that while we have some of the highest levels of people being upset with our government at all levels, not only just with the other guys in Congress or our president, but for the first time since 1994, we're seeing that 53% of people across the nation are angry with their own congressman in Congress. I mean, that's rare.
Yeah, that's a pretty big number.
Yeah, and in October 1994, it was only up to 43%. Today it's 51%. So that's huge. And they're saying that because of this, they don't expect people to show up. No one's going to show up. Everyone's upset, but no one's going to show up. And I know, and when I was out, when I was running for Congress, I've spoken to people, and I know they are very upset. And I think these pollsters are wrong, but it's really surprising because when I did the research on this, when I was writing an article about it, I suddenly found out, and I don't think most people know this. In 2010, the midterm elections, New York State ran 48th place out of all states in voters showing up to vote. The voter turnout in 2012 for the presidential election, New York State was 47th place.
You know, Mike, why do you think that is? Why do you think those numbers are so appallingly dismal?
Well, because people are. The thing you hear from everyone all the time is, my vote doesn't count.
And that's what you were told. Your vote doesn't matter. Your vote doesn't count. You're not that important in the election system. And people aren't interested in it. And that's why we see what's called voter apathy. It's a big deal and it's a big problem. Voter apathy has several components. And one of the sources we're going to use here is from an organization called Honest Ballot. And this is an article that they had from February of 2021. Voter apathy. Why don't people vote? In 2020, 67% of the voting population actually did get out and vote. That's a pretty small number. And yet, that's one of the highest numbers that the United States has ever seen. Part of the reason is because of a lack of interest, that people aren't watching the nightly news, or a lack of knowledge. People don't know anything about their candidates other than 30-second sound bites on commercials and ads. Or that people are disillusioned because people feel like their vote doesn't matter, that they've been told for so many decades one vote won't make a difference. They actually believe it. And of course, there's voter fatigue, the fact that there are elections every year. And there are many elections from the local to the presidential in any given year that people need to be involved with and to come out and vote for. So these are all reasons why people aren't voting. This is the apathy. And I think there's another aspect in it that we should also address. And that's, of course, the fact that you cannot have moral clarity without factual truth, based on a panel on impartiality, newsroom diversity, and trust in news. Americans don't trust their news. This is from Reuters, University of Oxford. People don't trust anymore. In fact, this is a quote from the Reuters editor-in-chief, Alessandra Galloni, who states that appearing trustworthy requires objectivity, transparency on the part of the journalist. To achieve this, newsrooms need to be diverse to make sure they cover as many perspectives as there are in the world outside them. Quote, the moment that journalists wade into the debate, they become part of the story. That potentially undermines the trust in us because if we have an agenda, then we become less credible. Referring to an article by Reuters Institute Director Ramos Kleis Nielsen, Alessandra added, quote, I really think you cannot have moral clarity without factual truth. Only once you have a foundation of fact, then you can have opinions. Well, we tend to believe that. It's a truism, something that we have seen over and over again. I'll give you an example of that. There's CNN. CNN has moved from Jeff Zucker to take on, they have a new leader in CNN, Chris Licht. And why is he in there? To turn the company around. And I quote, if you're looking to reimagine CNN and bring it closer to its original mission of just doing the news, Licht is your guy. Another quote, I would like to see CNN evolve back into the kind of journalism that it started with, and actually have journalists which would be unique and refreshing. And this is what we're hearing from Liberty Media Chair John Malone. Well, that makes the difference right there. People don't trust the news sources, the traditional major news media. Companies like CNN, MSNBC, ABC, even Fox News. People are divided because they don't trust the media sources they are receiving. There's too many problems. But when we add all of this up together, we get voter apathy. It's all of these reasons that are stopping people from voting, it would seem. Because when we look at this, we see voter turnout over the years as a percentage. In 2002, it was 40.5% of the public turned out to vote. In 2020, again, it was 66.7%. But look at every other year. Like in 2012, it was 58%. In the midterm elections of 2014, that election year, when I was just talking to WUTQ, it was 36.7%. When we look at this on a national basis, and we look at and I'm just going to pick out two states as an example. California, which we see in the turnouts, 68% in 2020, 49.6% in 2018, 58.4% in 2016, 30.7% in 2014, 57.7% in 2012, 45.9% in 2010. It was 61.7% in 2008. It was 41.2% in 2006, 59.6% in 2004, 37.3% in 2002. How about New York State? In New York State, going by those same years, 63.5, 45.2, 57.3, 29%. That's in 2014, a midterm election for our Congress. 53.5, 36.3, 59.6, 36.5, 58.5, 37% in 2002. And by the way, that compares to the total of the United States in those same years: 66.7, 50.3, 60.2, 36.7, 58.6, 41.8, 62.2, 41.3, 60.7, 40.5. The numbers are abysmal. Our nation overall isn't coming out to vote. In fact, if we look at PolitiFact, and this is looking specifically on New York State, one of the most populous, the fourth most populous state in the nation, the United States Election Project, with their election numbers dating back to the 1980s, ranked New York State the 14th lowest in voter turnout in 2016. The Census Bureau tracked turnout rates based on self-reporting data. Now, Dr. Michael McDonald of the University of Florida instead uses the total population of eligible voters in each state drawn from the administrative records. He then compares that population with the number of votes for the highest office on the ballot each year. New York State ranked in the bottom 10 states for voter turnout in all but 2 elections over the last decade. And I know a lot of people are talking about, well, what about the demographics? What about black votes? What about Hispanic votes? Black people can't vote in America, some people would tell you. Well, that's not exactly correct. If we're looking at the voting age citizens, and we're looking from 1994 going forward, well, blacks have been almost the same in terms of voting percentage as whites, and far more than Hispanics or any other group that's registered in America. And at the same time, the share of whites voting in elections since 1984 has gone down dramatically from about 85% down to 71% in 2020. That's just an amazing stat. So it's not a question of are black people voting in elections? They are. And they're voting very similar to the number of whites who are voting in elections. That's not really the question. I'll give you another example. In 2021, the voter turnout was low, especially even for an off year. Now, the full data for 2021 out of New York State isn't available. We've been searching for it. But what we can see is some anecdotal data. And what we see in county after county throughout New York State, and then as an example, in Broome and Tompkins counties, 27% of the people who are registered to vote actually cast a ballot. As a comparison, in 2017, 37% of voters turned out. Voters aren't showing up. In fact, if we look, and I want to look at black voters in the United States, looking at elections from 1964 to 2020, what do we see in this? Well, what we see is that, again, looking at the data, going from about 45% in 1964 to today in 2020, 58.7%, what we see is the total number of blacks in America who are voting has been increasing. We've seen that rising. In fact, we saw that rise since approximately 1972, when we saw the changes from the civil rights movement really start to take an impact. And we saw voting rights initiatives that were put in place, and they were effective. Blacks went from about 50% of the vote to about 69% of the vote. So black people are voting. That's a fact. We are seeing black people come out and they are voting, just like we're seeing whites voting. But overall, we're seeing less and less people come out and vote. And the things that most make people vote, Well, based on a 2015 report, we can see that direct mail, telling your neighbors if you voted, that's the most effective at 8%. In fact, if we look at this, at what actually gets people to come out and vote, what we're seeing on this list is absolutely nothing that affects people by their race or their ethnic group, but it does have to do with people being involved with each other, but none of them have a significant impact. 8% is the best, and everything else falls underneath that. So we have to ask a question. If what we are seeing in the trends, consistently and repeatedly, year after year, is that Black people are now voting, and they are voting in similar amounts to whites. And what we're seeing across this nation is less and less people are actually being involved in elections, except for presidential elections, and dramatically half as many at any other time. Something is wrong. Now, we hear from Democrats today. We hear from the Biden-Harris administration today. Well, the reason why people aren't voting is because they don't have access to vote. And yet, we have more access to vote in elections today than we've ever had before. The big questions, though, are, do people trust the elections? Do they trust when they vote? It's one of the big questions about apathy, that their vote must count. It's a question that even in 2014 people were asking, does my vote count? And they've been given good reason to question whether their vote actually does matter. Because looking at September 27th of 2019, researchers assembled over 100 voting machines, and hackers, cyber security experts, broke into every single one of those systems. That's scary, and this is coming from Mother Jones. Now, the report urged that election officials to use machines relying on voter marked up paper ballots and pair those with, quote, statistically rigorous post-election audits, doing audits after an election to make sure the election was fair and accurate. To verify the outcome of elections reflects the will of voters. The authors also warned that supply chain issues, quote, continue to pose significant security risks, end quote, including cases where machines include hardware components of foreign origin or where election administrators deploy foreign-based software, cloud, or other remote services. The report lands as officials in several states are working to upgrade electronic election equipment and as lawmakers in Washington, D.C. debate federal security, election security legislation and funding. But the key thing to take away is, as disturbing as this outcome is, we note that it is, at this point, an unsurprising result. However, it is notable, and especially disappointing, that many of the specific vulnerabilities reported over a decade earlier are still present in the systems today. The problem is people don't trust their elections because they have reason not to trust elections. The integrity of the election is a question, and that, we believe, feeds into the voter apathy at a high degree. You don't trust the news media because there is a bias, and you don't trust that your vote's going to matter because you can't trust the election system itself. The integrity is in question. So, is it a question of people being able to vote? Well, looking at many things, and we're going to address this, there is no problem with people being able to vote. Whether you're black, white, Hispanic, Asian, or anything else in the United States, the availability to go out and vote is exactly the same for everyone. And it has been for decades. The question is not, can people vote? It's why people don't want to vote. And I believe that that's in part and to a great degree because people don't feel like their vote matters anymore. That brings us to a conversation we heard last night. There was a webinar by Look Ahead America, and this is Matt Brainerd, the head of Look Ahead America. And he had a webinar talking about addressing that big concern, election integrity, that people can trust and have confidence in their elections. And he looked at 6 points of interest that say, can elections be more secure and therefore give more confidence to voters that their vote matters, that every vote they make is going to be received and logged properly. One of the most important issues that Matt Braynard brings up is a way to deal with both mail-in ballots and in-person ballots, a way to verify that the person who has made the ballot, especially in talking about mail-in ballots, that it is their vote. Because that's one of the biggest questions we have, which is that signature yours? Did you actually make that ballot? And this is true of any election whatsoever. So when the censors want to look at this, we're talking about all elections, not one specific election that they may have questions with, talking to YouTube and Facebook and some of the other social media giants. So what's the answer that Matt Braynard provides?
Moving forward, when people register to vote, on the voter registration form, we have a little block where they put their thumbprint. What about all the people who have already been registered? Are they going to have to all register to vote again? The answer is no. The first time they cast a new ballot, absentee ballot, that thumbprint becomes their prime, that all future ballots get compared against. And the first time they cast a ballot through absentee ballot, the first time they cast an absentee ballot with that thumbprint on it, first of all, they can't cast a duplicate ballot, right? Because it's going to match against something else. And moving on to future elections, it will be matched back to that prime. So it's not like we have to re-register everybody. Now, I do hear an objection from the more libertarian quarters, always so helpful, saying that, well, I don't want the government to have my fingerprint on file. Well, there's two answers to that. Number one is that we can make sure through statute and technology that when the county office or the state, which records the prime thumbprint, either when you register the first time you cast an absentee ballot with it, we can make sure that it is encrypted with a one-way hash that cannot be used to recreate your fingerprint in the other way. So it can be basically securely stored, so it only can be used for comparing to your fingerprint, when they get a subsequent absentee ballot in. The second is that, well, look, if you don't want the government to have access to your fingerprints, then you can't do an absentee ballot anyway, because your fingerprints are already all over it. You handled it. And it is, with today's technology, completely possible to, pull your signature off of any piece of paper. Like, I'm just touching this now. They can pull my prints off of this. So I think that's a pretty good rebuttal to folks who would raise the privacy issue. And, you have the same privacy issue when it comes to, well, I have to show a government an ID to cast a ballot. That's a privacy issue, too, in exactly the same way. So this is the one I think is the most powerful for preventing probably the biggest avenue for illegal ballots, which is casting ballots in someone else's name through the mail. And it's, media has written about it. Before the 2020 general election, the Washington Post said this was the most likely and largest potential way for illegal ballots to be cast, that we may not actually know who the deserved winner is for elections because of mail-in ballots fraud.
What we heard from Matt Braynard of Look Ahead America is a solution to a question that has a big impact. Again, going back to, where does voter apathy come from? Well, it takes away the disillusionment. It takes away that question that has been growing in America: does my vote count? Whether you're black, white, Hispanic, or anything else. It addresses the key concern, and what I believe, and what we believe here on this channel, is the major factor. People don't believe their vote matters. They don't believe that their vote is being counted properly. Whether it's a local election or a presidential election, it doesn't make a difference. And that question resolves the issue, thumbprints, resolves the issue of some of the questions that we had in 2019 about the integrity of the voting machines themselves. It addresses it in two ways. One, both being able to have a thumbprint attached to that vote in person and a thumbprint attached to that mail-in ballot to ensure that that is a secure ballot. And I think that answers one of the biggest questions. Now, you may disagree with that, but I think it's one of the biggest issues. And it answers the question of election integrity as well as voter apathy, which I don't think we see too many resolutions out there trying to address that. And of course, you're more than welcome to look at the entire view, the entire discussion by Matt Brainerd and Look Ahead America to see all 6 of the points that he's made about elections. It's 45 minutes, so we won't go into all of them, but it's a very interesting webinar, and he addresses many concerns in his remaining points, but we believe this is the strongest one. Now, I want to balance that against what we're seeing from Democrats at this time, looking at a bill that's being proposed right now, which is this is in the United States Senate, S 2747, which was introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat. It's a bill that's being supported by all 47 Democrats and both of the independents, which in fact are truly also Democrats in the United States Senate at this time. So what does the bill actually say? What is it that we can really take from this bill? Automatic voter registration. Now, this is a big issue that we see Democrats saying. They're saying that it's too difficult to vote and that people need automatic registration, which will increase the number of people who can vote at the same time that it would allow more people to come out and vote. But as we have seen over and over again, the question isn't whether people are registered to vote. People aren't coming out to vote. It's not the registrations that's stopping them. They have no interest. Again, they are disillusioned and they know very little about their candidates. And what they do know about the candidates isn't of interest. And they have a lack of trust in the news media organizations that are supposed to be providing them information about those elections. So saying that people can automatically vote, be registered, isn't an answer to apathy, nor does it improve integrity. In fact, the big question about automatic voter registration is we've seen bills and issues that have gone counter to that. One of the failures of automatic registrations is something that we've seen in New York State and other states like California, where we have illegal aliens, often referred to as undocumented immigrants, because the documentation they are missing is any authorization to be in the United States. And in New York State in 2019, we saw that New York State authorized driver's licenses for illegal aliens. That's the Green Light Bill, which at the time was Assembly Bill A3675. And this was passed into law. And the people of New York State did not agree. As we noted here, in April of this year, 55% of those polled in New York oppose or are against the idea of being able to have driver's licenses for illegal aliens. In June, just before this bill was taken and passed by the New York State Senate, 53% of everyone in New York State is against it. 2% of the Democrats, who are the only people who support this, jumped vote and said, no, they don't agree with this. That's important to understand. People were against giving the illegal aliens an opportunity to get a New York State's driver license. Why is that? Because in getting a New York State driver's license, you get the option to automatically sign up to get registered to vote. So an unknown number of illegal aliens potentially are able to get registered to vote, even though they don't have a right to do that. But New York State didn't stop at that, because what we saw is that 800,000 new voters were added to the rolls in New York State alone. And a similar bill in San Francisco allowed non-citizens to vote in elections there in California as well. But in New York State, it's 800,000 non-citizens, which can add up to 1/3 of all votes that normally occur in New York State. At the same time that we have fewer people actually voting because of voter apathy, because they don't believe their votes count. And this is something that a friend of mine, Larry Sharp, who's been on this program several times, that he addressed back in December of 2021.
This is where everything begins. This is where the mandates begin. This is where the horrible rules begin, all here. So now in New York City, for those of you who don't know, just recently, our city council has agreed that you don't have to be a citizen to vote in New York City. You can just be here and you can vote. Doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not. Now, for most people, you will go, oh my God, that's impossible. That must be some kind of mistake, Larry. Who would ever think that? You don't know my city, do you? Yes. And I want to show you a couple things which will make you understand what's going on and how I feel about this. I do feel this goes too far because now this is past, in my view, it's past the Constitution. Now it's past citizenship, right? That, in my view, is a bridge too far. Do I want American citizens to be more independent on their own and to push back from state and federal government? Yes, yes, and yes, of course I do. But note what I'm saying. Consenting, U.S. citizen, adults. That's what I'm saying. So this, to me, is a bridge too far.
And it's important to understand, this is a bridge too far for libertarians, that this violates the Constitution at its core. And when we combine that with the Green Light Bill, which was passed in 2019, well, then we have illegal aliens being authorized and capable of being able to vote in elections at numbers so high, they wind up being 1/3 potentially of all votes in New York State. And those votes and those individuals cannot be separated from other voters. There aren't separate ballots for non-citizens and citizens. There aren't separate ballots for local races versus national races or even statewide races. That doesn't exist. So how do we know the difference? And that, again, goes back to the same question of voter apathy, where we see people are disillusioned. They don't believe that their vote counts, where people have a lack of interest in being involved in a vote, where they know that 800,000 people that have nothing to do with this nation, their state, or their locality will be able to alter the outcome of that vote. When we hear that they say that automatic voter registration is going to improve voter turnout, we don't believe it. Because this isn't something that's helping people, American citizens, to vote. In fact, it's not saying that American citizens can't get registered to vote. That's not an apparent problem anywhere in the United States. Another item that we're seeing Democrats are asking for is Election Day as another legal public holiday. Could that help voter turnout? Maybe, but it doesn't address the issues that are stopping people from coming out to vote. The question people are having aren't, can they get to the ballots? That's not a problem. We have extended early voting. We have mail-in voting, and we have in-person voting for extended hours in virtually every single state. All three things exist. The question isn't, can people vote? It's that people don't want to vote. So again, we're not seeing that Democrats are helping to relieve the apathy, nor are they making the elections more integrally sound. And that's a problem. The third thing that they're promoting right now is internet registrations, which goes back to the question that we see from Matt Brainerd. Do you trust who is making that registration? The internet is known for being an anonymous source where people are unknown by and large. How can you verify that that individual who registered online is in fact the person who's going to show up and vote or who's making that vote? There is a question there, a question that brings us back to increasing the disillusionment of the public and the lack of confidence in our elections and in our media, which already has an inherent bias. this isn't helping us to get past that source. Let's go on to another item. Same-day voter registration. Again, this is a suggestion that is being made by Democrats to say, well, this will make people turn up and vote. Except, as we have shown you, people can turn up and vote. In fact, they do turn out and vote. As we have seen consistently, people came out to vote in 2020. They didn't come out to vote in 2018. They didn't come out to vote in 2014. They didn't come out to vote in large numbers in 2012 or 2010. They didn't show up to vote in 2002. So it's not a question of can people come out to vote. They do when they think it's important, when they think their vote matters. They don't when they don't feel that they have a voice. So apathy takes hold, not because of the lack of ability. And again, we have another problem with same-day voter registration, which goes back to what Matt Brainerd was talking about thumbprint verification. If you have same-day registration, how are you sure that this person is, one, a United States citizen, and two, authorized to vote, and not voting in multiple locations, as the only thing you have is a signature that may or may not address whether that person is legally able to vote in that one location, and or whether they've registered to vote in multiple locations and or multiple states. This doesn't address that. We have the same-day registration. It increases the complexity of our elections and being able to verify and make sure that we have a secure election. The integrity issue is at question here. So what we've seen in just 4 of the items that should tell us that this bill, that Bill 2747 in the United States Senate, is not addressing and helping to improve the number of people who will vote. This isn't going to increase the number of people who vote. In fact, it could potentially decrease the number of people who vote because it doesn't address the reasons why people aren't voting. And that is a problem. And we've seen that lots of people have questions because when we look at this, when we do what was suggested in 2019, when we look at 2019 and we look at the suggestion that was made, which was to have audits, actual post-election audits, when they have been done, as we see in Arizona, where cyber ninjas found that there were 5,047 votes that may have cast more than one vote in one county, regardless of the number of votes that this may be, the percentage, regardless of whether it changes an election or not, doesn't matter. It's the fact that there is a question about the integrity of the votes that have been made, a question of the integrity of our voting system. And that is a bigger issue. In fact, that's why we have audits, to guarantee the integrity of it. And when we see 5,000 votes, well, that's from one county. Imagine how many counties that could be. And if that's a similar number in multiple counties, in multiple states, how secure is that election? Even if that comes out to only 1% or even 0.5%, how many people are less confident in that next election? How many people are disincentivized to be able to go out and vote because they are now disillusioned? That's the question. If we don't trust our elections because we have reasons not to trust our elections, and we're seeing that there are problems in the election system as it exists, but those problems aren't being addressed by the concerns in Congress from the Democratic Party, the majority party at this time, and solutions that make sense aren't being implemented, then what's the point of voting? That's a serious question. And we know that, and to be fair, in Arizona, we found that the election, the results of the audit said that the election was fair. Fantastic. That in Maricopa County, the election was fair. There was no interference from outside sources, that the code was not maliciously altered, that everything was found to be correct. And yet it was also found that individuals may have double voted. So there is a question here. And we know that there are people who have had problems. But the questions that we're talking about aren't just limited to whether or not a thumbprint would verify an individual, not just limited to whether non-citizens are allowed to vote in elections that citizens only should be allowed to vote in. It's not just that we have a question about online registrations and not being able to verify them. It's not just about same-day registrations that, again, add that question of doubt. It's not just a disillusionment that we're seeing, but we're seeing that many laws that have been passed in Democratic strongholds, like New York State, have created an environment where people don't want to vote. They are actually increasing the net apathy that we are seeing, as we have this example of a voter who came to us and spoke publicly and provided us documentation about the experience that he had in voting in 2021, as you can hear right now. As a channel, we're not saying you did or did not go through this experience, because I can't. But in that moment that you, as you have told us, you have been told first that you cannot do your lawful right of being able to vote. Then you are told, okay, we're going to allow you to vote only under certain very specific conditions. And you have been now placed on the side, shunned from society, and made to wait until an accommodation that these people in charge of the election process were there. Let me ask you, do you feel like that is affecting the way you voted?
Not the actual physical what I cast on the ballot per se, because it didn't change my thought process, my ideology, but like affecting my desire to want to go vote in the future not midterm,
Yes.
but midterm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm disabled. I walk with a cane. I got a severe breathing problem from a chemical burnt lungs, so it's difficult for me to get out and move around and spend time out and do things.
So it makes you feel less likely, or
Correct.
Let me not put words in your mouth, did it make you feel like, if this is what I have to go through, I'm less inclined to go out and vote again?
Yes, it was a struggle that day for me to go out to begin with, which is why I waited till later at night and I said, you know what, let's just do it. Let's go. If I have to go through this every time, or even every other time, well, is it even worth it?
And see, that's the problem. That's why we are seeing less people vote. And regardless of the individual's skin color, and regardless of that factor, it's the question that, does your vote matter? And is the election secure? And are you welcomed to vote? This was in New York State. And yes, the individual who's speaking was a person of color, but that doesn't really matter, because that experience by anyone, and anyone hearing about that experience, would be deterred from being able to go out and vote in a subsequent election. And that's the problem. That's the voter apathy, which is not being addressed by any of the voting rights regulations that Democrats are suggesting that we need to have, because those suggestions from Democrats aren't affecting these issues. And it's on top of the fact that we are seeing over and over again that many of these new regulations that were introduced in recent elections have been overturned. In particular, in the Supreme Court, which we saw on the question of HB 2023, which is the Supreme Court case of Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, which was argued on March 2nd, 2021, and decided on July 1st of 2021 in a 6-3 decision. It doesn't change the fact that we are seeing in the news on January 28th of 2022 that the Pennsylvania mail-in voting law was struck down, that we got to see in March 12th of 2022 that the election officials that an election official in Michigan was charged with ballot tampering. These are reasons why people aren't voting, why people feel like they can't go out and vote. Because their vote doesn't count. They are disillusioned. They are discouraged. Not because of the color of their skin, not because they can get out or they can or cannot get out to a polling location. They can. It's not because people can't register. They can and they do. They can do so as blacks, Hispanics, whites, whatever in America. They can and they do. They just don't have a reason to do any of this because they are looking at legislation that is circumventing their rights, that they are being persecuted when they go in because of these new regulations, that their vote is being diluted, if not nullified, by some of these regulations that we have shown you. That is the problem. Now, we decided to do this video because of Matt Brainerd and his webinar on election integrity. And he mentions 6 different points that can help restore the confidence of Americans in their elections that their vote counts. And we think you should listen to that and come to your own decision. But we think it's important that you need to understand. The question is not, can you vote in America, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Indian, whatever it may be? You can, and people do, in almost equal numbers, no matter what the racial background you may have. And it's not a question of availability because people have access to register, to mail in votes, to early vote, and to vote in person. And they're doing that, but they're doing it less. The question is, do you want to vote? Do you want to be involved in that next election? Do you have, are you encouraged to be able to vote in that polling place, whether it because of pandemic regulations or because 800,000 non-citizens are voting and outweighing your vote? These are significant questions that we need to address in this nation. Because if we continue to do this, if we continue to see this kind of downturn, just as we have seen back in 2014, that your voice is your vote is your voice. You should be heard. And yet, we aren't seeing that. And people across the country, and especially in states like New York State, the 4th most populous state in the nation, people don't want to vote. It's not because they can't. It's not because of the color of their skin. It's because we aren't addressing the integrity of those elections. Now, that's what we believe. And you may disagree. You may think it's impossible or difficult as someone who is black or Hispanic to be able to go out and vote. I've never run into that problem. I don't know anyone who has had that problem. Not in my family, my friends, where I have lived across this nation at any point in my lifetime. That hasn't been it. Now I'm 54. If you go back to the 1960s and 1950s, maybe you have a point. But in 2022, that isn't the issue. It's not the ease of access, it's the desire. We have to address apathy. We have to make sure that people feel secure in their vote and that it will be counted and that others are not diluting their vote or that they're not being persecuted because of election laws. That's what we need to see to improve our elections. Otherwise, we'll continue to see elections like 2014, like 2016, 2010. We're going to see fewer and fewer people vote. That's what we believe. But we look forward to hearing what you believe. We thank you for going through the entire video, and we hope that you'll also join us every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to add your voice to this very important issue and many others. Thank you.